This episode was recorded during the virtual seminar for women parliamentarians of the Americas and Caribbean on the defense, peace, and security agenda titled, "With All That's Going On Right Now, The Challenge of Political Leadership During Crisis," jointly organized by ParlAmericas, the Parliamentary Centre, and the Global Centre for Pluralism. In this presentation, Meredith Preston McGhie, Secretary General of the Global Centre for Pluralism, speaks about the importance of valuing diversity in order to achieve transformative change for peace. During her presentation, she explores the concepts of leadership during crises, pluralism, and the need for women's leadership rooted in human-centered peace.
It's a real honor to be speaking with all of you for this discussion, and really just a special thanks to ParlAmericas for inviting us to this collaboration. It's a really great opportunity for us to be sharing some thoughts. As I was introduced, I lead the Global Centre for Pluralism. We're based here in, today, a very snowy Ottawa on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. The Global Centre was founded as a joint initiative between the Government of Canada and His Highness the Aga Khan, and really founded on this core belief that our societies thrive when diversity is valued. And so that's really the lens that I wanted to talk to you about today when we think about these issues, as Guadalupe introduced, characteristics of good leadership, and really these questions of what transformative change for peace can look like. I'm a peacemaker by background. I spent about 20 years across Africa working on peace processes, and before that in Asia and in the Middle East. And I think right now we all feel the weight of the times that we are living through. And so I've been reflecting a lot on, in these last few months, certainly since the 7th of October, but also before that, about leadership and pluralism and the state of our societies and what it means to be a leader in this particular historical moment. And I think the first thing is, as we all know well, is that we need women's leadership in this moment, and has been said, we need women's leadership everywhere, not just in women's spaces, certainly, but also that we need to ensure that women's leadership is also really rooted in pluralism and rooted in peace. And as Margarita just noted, human-centered peace, peace that really focuses on the agency and belonging of people. At the Global Centre, we focus all of our time on thinking about how societies treat diversity, and also how we can help leaders in different sections of society build their pluralism muscles. So how do you build your instincts towards embracing difference, leaning into difficult conversations, ensuring those are more nuanced, and really committing essentially to be disagreeing agreeably? And what we're seeing right now is that this has never been more difficult. What we are seeing is that disagreements are seen as fundamental and unbridgeable differences, rather than something that should make us lean into the discussion and make us curious about why someone sees the world differently than we see it. And so in these moments, I think what we see at the center is that pluralism is a really core ethic that we can draw upon in these more divided times. We can often imagine a pluralist society as an aspirational thing that our whole society needs to be driving towards. But I think it's particularly useful to be thinking about it as an ethic that shapes our own individual choices, as well as the decisions that societies are taking, and that it is fundamentally action-oriented as a leadership principle. We all know that all of our societies are diverse. We're diverse in our culture, religion, language, ethnicity, geography, gender, generation, and so forth. And that's a fact in all of our societies. And so pluralism really is these actions that we take to respond positively to these differences. And we see that often these actions are becoming more complicated in the global space that we inhabit. But at the same time, at the Global Centre, we really do see a lot of really spectacular local leadership and action on these issues where they're able to embrace society's diversity as strengths rather than to see them as threats or as things that are unbridgeable or unreconcilable. We know that pluralism expresses itself in the systems and norms in our society. So the laws that many of you have talked about, important international norms like Security Council Resolution 1325 and the domestication of that through national action plans. Your own legislators, I think Anita Vandenbelt said at the beginning that legislators are often the sort of front lines of democracy and really very much at the forefront of the pluralist system in different societies. And we at the center think about this as pluralism's hardware, but then we have to also really think about the norms and the narratives that are swirling around in our society. What stories are being told? What are our children being taught in schools? How is the media and the online space treating diversity? And these social norms and narratives, which we often think about as pluralism software, really impacts the ability of the hardware system. It impacts how we apply laws and policies. It can impact which laws and policies are in fact passed in particular places. But similarly, the laws and policies can impact those social norms and narratives. And so we see a real cycle between the interactions between the hardware and the software. And we see this unique in all contexts, but I'm already struck by the commonality of what has been discussed today, because there are really some universal ethics that underpin this, particularly for us, for leadership. And the core principle of a pluralist ethic for leadership is really to commit to the dignity of all people in society being recognized and leading to ensure that everyone feels that they belong. And so how do we do that as legislative leaders, as civil society leaders, as leaders in media and public sphere? But how do we do that particularly at a moment when trust in institutions is at its maybe lowest point that we have seen in our own careers, and that trust in the political and legislative processes is low? So how do we lead discussions that help people not only feel that they're part of a society, because that's part of belonging, but also that others recognize that they are part of the same society, even with their differences? And that people recognize and are given space to play a role, that they have agency in the direction that the society is going. Because one of the trends that we're seeing that I think is really concerning, you may have noticed the BBC Read lectures have just come out. They're on the future of democracy, and so really worth a listen. And one of the real enemies to democracy in these spaces is the dislocation of people feeling that they don't have agency, which is so central to belonging, and people therefore stepping away from the democratic process and from these engagements. And so we need to really lean into these pluralist spaces, but I think we also need to think really strongly about how we can actually use peace leadership in these moments, even when we are not in so-called situations of conflict. And for many years, when I was working in spaces of extreme conflict in Somalia and South Sudan and Nigeria and elsewhere, I would talk a lot about how the middle ground was a particularly dangerous place to be. In conflict, people were picking a side or would have a side imposed on them. And the middle ground would kind of become a no person's zone. And the people who deliberately stood in that zone and really tried to see all of the different perspectives and tried to bring others to see those perspectives would often come under attack because that was threatening to one side or the other within the conflict. And so the middle ground was a dangerous space to be, but it was also a very powerful space to be because it is where the solutions can come. And again, to, I think, the beautiful points that were just made about human-centered peace. This doesn't come from the dominance of one side or the other. It comes from listening and compromises and transformation for people to find their way through violent conflict into spaces where you can disagree respectfully. But what's striking to me about that experience from conflict zones is how much I'm seeing that reflected in a lot of our societies today that in theory are not in so-called situations of conflict, and how difficult it is for us to hold this middle ground space in our current social and political spheres in our own societies. And I think about the middle ground when I talk to people in Canada. Often people assume that that means that I'm a political centrist, that I'm talking about being in the political middle. But I'm not. What I'm thinking about is the respectful public commons that is essential for a pluralist society. We need a place and a space where people can debate and discuss with compassion and respect and feel that those things are being heard, and therefore they're able to move forward. I was speaking with a former Supreme Court Justice in Canada, very involved in some of the academic spaces that are really struggling with the divisions around Israel and Gaza in this moment. And she reflected that places where she has seen things actually being more constructive, leaders have not forced everyone to come together and agree, but they've given space for the grief on both sides. They've given space for people to process and to be heard, and then tried to find ways where some of those ideas can cross the barriers, but again, giving space for people not only to express, but to feel genuinely that they're heard. And so that was sort of the first piece that I wanted to really speak to, is how legislative leaders like all of yourselves and all of us in society can really use our pluralist muscles to lean in to these conversations that really build empathy for one another, even when we're not necessarily agreeing. And I'm really conscious that the social media space makes this particularly challenging. But again, I do believe that there is a moment for women to lead and engage with this complexity. So I thought I would offer a couple of examples of places where some of our partners are doing some of this extraordinary work. We at the Global Center are very fortunate to confer a Global Pluralism Award every 2 years. It is awarded to individuals and organizations and institutions who really exemplify pluralism in action around the world. This is also, of course, an opportunity to mention to any of you. I'm sure you know these kinds of organizations and individuals in your own societies. Nominations for the next round will come out in the spring. But what it's enabled us to do at the Global Center is to demonstrate what it actually looks like to lead with pluralism, what it actually looks like to do what I'm talking about. So I wanted to give 2 examples from our Global Pluralism Award laureates this year. And the first is a peacemaker in northern Lebanon. Leah Baroudi works with youth involved in the sectarian violence in Lebanon and in Syria. There was a real extreme rise in sectarian violence in northern Lebanon when the conflict in Syria broke out. And what she found when she went into these areas was that often the root causes of the violence, again, were not necessarily religiously, ideologically driven, but they were driven by marginalization. They were driven by this sense of dislocation and a lack of belonging. And so she has worked with young men in these spaces through drama and through creating dialogue spaces with young men to really try to bring them into spaces where they can begin to unpack their own identities and figure out how they can connect across divides with other colleagues that were on the other side of the conflict at one point. And she remarked to me in her work that one of the things that she's seen and is seeing today, of course, she's in Lebanon, so she's very, very close to what's happening right now in Gaza. She said that when a particular identity is threatened in any of us, particularly when you are experiencing marginalization, you see that identity rise to the surface and essentially take over many of the other facets of who you are. And it can very easily, therefore, become radicalized. And when she was able to break that down, she was able to build a series of processes through drama and dialogue and elsewhere where these young men were able to internally start to break down some of these barriers and figure out how they could live with the complex and multi-layered identities that all of them held. And why I find this a particularly inspiring example is that Leah asked why. So when we talk about radicalization, when we talk about countering terrorism, when we talk about conflict or division in our societies, it's really incumbent on us to ask why it's happening and figure out what the levers might be that enable us to find some alternative paths towards addressing that marginalization, dislocation, or division. So the second example that I wanted to offer from another of our laureates this last awards cycle is a woman called Dia Khan. And she's a filmmaker from Norway. Her films are phenomenal, and I'm happy to place a link in the chat for those who are interested. She runs a production company called Fuse, produces her own Emmy-winning documentaries, focused on understanding the dynamics behind jihadists, white supremacists, militia groups, and terrorists. And what's particularly powerful about her approach is that she, as a Muslim woman of color, will sit with white supremacists for hours and talk and listen and try to understand why they think what they think, why they do what they do. And then in a phenomenally gentle way is able to then offer some windows into the alternatives, some windows into the impact of their perspectives, and build relationships with many of these individuals through the filmmaking process. There's some really interesting testimony by white supremacists in the United States who really credit her with them seeing why their perspectives needed to change and beginning to shift some of those spaces. But for her to do it, she's had to lean into these incredibly complicated and nuanced and deeply uncomfortable conversations. And so I think this really leads me to the sort of final point, which has been occupying my mind in these moments, especially in the space of global division that we find ourselves in, which existed before the 7th of October, to be sure, but feels like it's really been on hyperdrive since then, is the need to kind of hold these multiple truths, multiple identities, multiple griefs in our space at the same time. And I think as a core element of pluralist leadership is really helping our own societies and communities recognize that these multiple spaces for identity and for understanding of what's going on need to happen at the same time.